Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend a few minutes with The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers. This book was originally published back in 1940, and I read this edition here. You can see commemorating the 100th birthday for Carson McCullers in 2017. 1917 to 2017. When I was reading up on the author, my understanding is she passed away in 1967. I did not write that down in my notes, but that's from memory. I think she passed away in 1967 at a relatively young age of, I think, around 52. So, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers. I have been wanting to read this book literally for years and years. I don't know why I never had read it. But I just decided this year was going to be my year to do it. So I did it, and I'm so glad I did, because this was, what a read this was. This book is just really amazing. So I'm going to be really careful to not give away anything, as usual, in my chats. I always try to do this, but from that would detract from the first-time reader from experiencing the book. So I'm going to be careful not to do that. I thought I would approach this book by just really going over a few of the main characters and then a couple of the big themes that I took away from the book towards the end of the chat. So the book takes place in a smallish textile mill town in Georgia over the course of about a year from 1938 to 1939. And so the main character, so as the book opens, we get introduced to a character named John Singer, who is a deaf man who lives with another deaf man whose name is Antonopoulos, and they have a fairly happy life. John Singer works at a jeweler doing engraving, and Antonopoulos works in a relative's candy store. And so they have this relatively happy life together, and so because they can communicate with each other. John Singer actually can read lips, mostly, but he has his happiest times with Antonopoulos. Eventually, in the book, they don't live together. I won't give away exactly what happens, but they don't. But they still stay in contact through letters, and John goes and visits him. Singer goes and visits him. So, we get to know John Singer's inner life. We don't know a lot about him from the other characters, because the other characters, he eventually becomes their focal point. But, we know him mostly from the letters that he writes to Antonopoulos once Antonopoulos lives somewhere else. So, yeah, John Singer. And then we have Mick Kelly. Mick Kelly is a young girl, about 14 years old. She's living with this family. Now, remember, this is 1938 when the book opens, and so it's still the Depression, and her family is really struggling. They live in they run a boarding house, and her father works on watches and things like that. They don't have hardly any money, and so she goes to school, but she has these big dreams. She has this really rich inner world that she calls the inside room, and she doesn't let anybody know. She's really private about her inside room, and so she loves classical music, and she wants to compose it, and she actually writes down. She figures out I think she has briefly piano lessons, but her family's so poor, of course, she can't really take them. They don't even have a radio. She has to go to a neighbor's somewhere else. This is the 40s or the late 30s, and so no one has air conditioning. She can hear people's radios, and she knows which families listen to classical music in the evenings, and she sometimes goes and sits outside their windows and listens in on classical music programs. So, yeah, Mick Kelly. And then we have Dr. Copeland, who is an African-American doctor. This is the late 30s, so it's in Georgia. So everything is segregated, and so he is the doctor to the African-American community. He's a very stern person and very sort of judgmental, and he's very concerned about justice for the African-American community and how they can overcome the racism that's all around them and that keeps them, oppressed. And so he has very specific ways that he thinks is the way forward to overcome that. And not everybody in the actually most people in the African American community don't really understand him. They're actually a little bit afraid of him, including all of his children and his ex-wife. His wife actually left years before, and I believe she's since passed away when the book opens. But his children, only his daughter Portia really has any kind of connection to him, and she tries to keep a connection with him, but everybody's kind of afraid of him because of his sort of rigid views on how things should be and how the African American should be. And then we have Jake Blount. Jake Blount is a man who's really, he's just drifted. He's kind of a drifter. He's drifted into town. He's drunk most of the time. All he talks about is trying to overthrow the capitalist system. He's a Marxist, I guess, a communist, and the oppression, the economic oppression that everybody has. And so that's his sort of focus. And then we have Biff Brannon, Bartholomew Brannon, everybody calls him Biff. He runs a diner in town. And so as the story opens, he's got this marriage. He and his wife aren't terribly unhappy, but they're not really happy either, not really connected to each other all that much. As a matter of fact, the book says, they've taken to calling each other Mr. and Mrs. So the wife calls him Mr. Brannon and he calls her Mrs. Brannon. They sort of take different shifts running the cafe, and so they don't see each other even all that much. And so after Antonopoulos ends up leaving and no longer living with Singer, the deaf man, he moves in to the boarding house with the Kellys, with Mick Kelly's family. And so at that point, all the other characters, Mick, the little girl, the young girl, Jake, the rabble-rouser, Dr. Copeland, the African-American doctor, and Biff Brannon, the diner owner, come to see him all the time because I think, they just project onto him whatever they feel like most comfortable with. And so therefore they're all really comfortable with him. He gives off this sense of peace. He sits very attentively and listens to everything they say. They don't seem to ask him much, and he never really says anything back much. And if he does, they often just kind of blow past it, because they just really want to tell their story to him, and he sits there and listens, and so they sort of project themselves onto him, but they think him they each have a different version of who they think he is. Like I said, we don't really know either as the reader. We get little glimpses into what he actually thinks through his letters and his visits to his friend Antonopoulos once he moves to a different place. So, yeah, a couple of really... That's really the main characters. So Portia, Dr. Copeland's daughter, she's not really a main character per se. She's not in this orbit of Singer like the other main characters, but she is really kind of a cool character because I think what she's showing is a way to be happy amidst all the loneliness sort of in the world. She lives with her husband Highboy, who's called Highboy, and her brother William. Everybody calls him Willie. And so those three live together and seem to have a very, very happy life, even though they struggle all the time for money, like almost all the other characters in the book. But they struggle with money, but they divvy it out. So like one of them is responsible for paying the rent. One of them pays, I think, for the entertainment, and then another one pays for whatever. But they have a happy life throughout, for at least the first half of the book. They have a happy life together, period. They are just, I'll talk more about that here in a bit. So big themes. So the big themes of the book. So loneliness. The heart is a lonely hunter. Yeah, loneliness. All of these characters are lonely in different ways. So they're all sort of not connected or isolated. Can we say it's really because of them? Not really, because maybe part of the human condition is being somewhat lonely. We're kind of in this body by ourselves, and you can only connect with another person so much. Some seem to do it better than others. John Singer, for example, Singer and Antonopoulos have at least on Singer's side, have a good connection. And during that era when they're living together, they don't seem to be lonely. And Singer doesn't seem to be lonely. And then, for Portia and High Boy and Willie, they're not lonely, but the other characters are. So Dr. Copeland, Jake Blunt, Biff Brannon, the diner owner, and Mick Kelly, for different reasons. So, yeah, loneliness. And then the other thing is injustice. So injustice, I jotted this down. Injustice in the book. Injustice, we have economic injustice, racial injustice, physical injustice, spiritual injustice, and gender injustice. And each of the characters represents one of these, in my opinion, sort of one of the takeaways I had from the book. Economic injustice. So this would be Jake Blunt, the sort of the drifter, rabble-rouser, Marxist. So he's really focused on the economic injustice of capitalism during the late 30s, and how people are really exploited and sort of abused by, the capitalist system. Then racial injustice, Dr. Copeland, very concerned with the African American community and the racial injustice and oppression that that community experienced. And then, we see this like firsthand. I won't go into what happens, but with him, even though he's a doctor, an educated person who's got a status, as far as money and things, middle class status, still gets treated, called boy and uncle, and so racial injustice is concerning Dr. Copeland. Physical injustice. So this would be John Singer, the deaf fella. So he can't hear. So the society around him, the hearing society around him, treats him almost like an object. So even the characters who really, really like him, these main characters that come and visit him all the time, really use him as really just a mirror or a sounding board. They put onto him whatever they want it to be. They come and tell him all these things they wouldn't tell other people, but they don't really ever seem to want to. They think they know him just by their assumptions. They don't actually do any effort to really get to know him at all, And so he lives this really isolated, in this really isolated world. And then spiritual injustice, Mick Kelly, this young girl, who has these dreams of learning music and composing. Her family can't afford to even get her piano lessons. And so, as the novel progresses, we really see this, this injustice that she's going to face as she gets older, as far as having the opportunities to pursue, her sort of self-actualization that she foresees for herself as a 14, 15-year-old girl. And then finally, gender injustice. I'm calling it gender injustice. So Biff Brannon, the owner of the diner, I won't give away exactly what happens to him, but there's a transition in his home life, we'll say that. And then, we see this different side of him. He's not really gender conforming, which I was a little surprised about in this book from 1940. It's very it's very ambiguous about where he's coming from, but, he's this very physically a very masculine person. The book describes how he has to shave twice a day. He's got this really dark beard that has to be shaved constantly. He gets this 5 o'clock shadow very quickly. And so he's very masculine as far as physical appearances go. But, it's quite different. Someone says he would make a really good mother, and he thinks that's a great compliment. And he likes to sew. And, these other things that we understand, that he's not really a gender conforming person, but he's sort of put into that box that he's already expected to live a certain role. So, yeah, that. And then before I run out of time, freedom. Freedom is talked about in this book a lot, and based on those injustices, can you really be free if you are under economic oppression? and have to be a wage slave? Are you really free if you suffer the sort of racial injustice that Dr. Copeland and the African Americans face? Are you really free, if you have if society treats you a certain way because you don't have a physical trait that all they do, such as hearing? Are you really free if you can't self-actualize like young Mick Kelly? She's not really free to become who she wants to become because of conditions around her. And then finally, are you really free if you're trapped into sort of a gender conformity that doesn't fit you? So, that idea of freedom there too. Oh, I'm out of time, so I'm going to let the chat go at that. The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Very, very good read. Loved it very much. My next chat is going to be A Sinking Ship is Still a Ship, a collection of poetry by Ariel Francisco. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, take care. Bye.